in place already. You have an interim leadership council. Even if, for example, let's say Mojtaba becomes the next supreme leader and Israelis decide to separate their path from the Americans and decide to strike him, the interim leadership council can again continue to work. And because of the constitutional powers that they have. So, again, as I said, you're talking about a very resilient regime that was born into a revolution, survived assassination of the early 1980s, and also fought a war with Iraq. I think the system is more resilient than one thinks.
Hassan, I want to talk to you about these missiles that are said to have been fired from Iran towards Turkey. This was 24 hours ago, towards the airspace of Turkey, I should say. And now we have this incident in Azerbaijan. Both countries have been blaming Iran for this. Iran has been saying, no, it's definitely not us. If it's not Iran, is there any suspicion about who it might have been?
Well, the line here brought up by officials is that this can well be a false flag operation, just as attacking oil and gas infrastructure, because both strategically don't make sense for Iran to pull off at this point. It is hitting where it thinks that it's being attacked from the bases and infrastructure, military and security of the United States and Israel, and to drag Turkey and Azerbaijan into this, where there hasn't been any line of them or their airspace being used, would defy the logic that has been held up by officials here. And it doesn't make sense because Iran is focused on the bases and infrastructure that are being used. To spread that out means less concentration on those targets that Iran sees as primarily the main places that should be affected, not to be used against Iran, both in Israel and the U.S. bases and infrastructure in the Persian Gulf countries. So I don't. I think the official line on them being false flag operation makes sense. We are yet to see what evidence there on the part of Azerbaijan and Turkey that suggests Iran is involved. They said it because they, I think, are overwhelmed with what Iran has done in the past few days. But I think that doesn't make sense from an Iranian perspective.
Sina Azadi, I want to get your interpretation of this. The suggestion being, at least as the message that seems to be going out within Iran, that these are false flag operations. That doesn't obviously identify who might have carried out the attacks, but nevertheless that it is not Iran. In your assessment, though, how likely is it that countries like Azerbaijan, countries like Turkey, and obviously the Gulf states, who have also seen their own oil infrastructure hit, we've just been reporting on one just in the last hour or so. How likely is it, do you think, that those provocations would actually encourage any of these countries to start attacking Iran when each one has said, no, we are maintaining a defensive posture in this?
Well, I'm sure that the Arab countries and the Turks and the Azerbaijanis have so far shown restraint, especially in the case of the Arabs of the Persian Gulf. But the public opinion in the Arab countries, based on what I know and what I've heard, I've spoken to my Arab friends in the region, is that their lives have been disrupted, and there's a sense of enough is enough. But the point is, and I don't think in the case of Turkey, I don't believe that Iranians would be interested in picking up a fight with Turks who are a member of NATO. But the point for Iran at this point is that if it's fighting the world's best military force and the Middle East's best military force, it doesn't matter if you're adding the Arab countries to the equation anymore, because the force of the United United States is enough to overwhelm Iran's military forces. This doesn't mean that Iranians are not fighting back, but just the sheer imbalance of power between Iran and the US makes a decisive victory for Iranians very unlikely. So, going back to your question, I think that it is likely that the public pressure increases on the Arabs, but I don't think I see it unlikely that they decide to intervene because there is no need for them, and the U.S. and the Israelis are already relentlessly bombing Iran. Iranian cities have been destroyed, military infrastructure, as it was in your reporting. A sport complex was targeted in Tehran. So I don't think there is no need for them to intervene, but there's certainly public pressure rising.
Sina Zodi, Director of the Middle East Studies Program at George Washington University, and Hassan Ahmadi, an Associate Professor at the University of Tehran. Thank you both. It's just past 16:30 GMT. You're watching Al Jazeera's continuing coverage of the conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran. I'm Rob Matheson. The Israeli army has been bombing areas across Lebanon. It's now issued forced displacement orders for areas in the southern suburbs of Beirut. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah has been escalating since the killing of Iran's supreme leader. Israel has also launched a new wave of attacks in Iran. Loud explosions have been heard in Tehran and cities across the country. State media say more than 1,200 people have been killed since the US and Israel began their assault on Saturday. The United Arab Emirates says it's responding to incoming missiles and drones from Iran. Intercepted missiles have been seen in the skies above Abu Dhabi. In nearby Bahrain, authorities say a fire from a strike on an oil refinery has been brought under control. And France has authorized US forces to use some of its bases on French territory, but on the condition they're not used to strike Iran. American troops will have temporary access to the bases to help protect Gulf countries. The UK has also announced it's sending additional forces to the Middle East.
I can announce today that we're sending 4 additional Typhoon jets to join our squadron in Qatar to strengthen our defensive operations in Qatar and across the region.
Azerbaijan is the latest country to be impacted by this conflict. 4 people there were injured after 2 drones fell near an international airport. Baku has summoned the Iranian ambassador and has told its military to prepare retaliatory measures. Well, as we've been reporting, France has authorized US forces to use some of its bases on the condition that they're not used to strike Iran. American troops will have temporary access to some bases on French territory. The French General Staff says the move is to, quote, contribute to the protection of our partners in the Gulf. Natasha Butler has more from Paris.
Well, there had been some confusion here in France over whether or not the United States was able to use French military air bases in the Gulf. Well, the French military have clarified the situation. What they are saying is that some US aircraft used only for logistical and support purposes can use some French air bases, but here in France, the French military are also saying that they have guarantees from the US military that those aircraft are not at all involved in any airstrikes on Iran. Well, the French President Emmanuel Macron has condemned the US and Israeli airstrikes on Iran as going against breaking international law and rules. And he says that France will remain in a purely defensive position. He's had phone calls with the US President and with the Israeli Prime Minister and mentioned as such. He has called for a de-escalation of tensions, as has the French Foreign Minister, who has spoken to his Iranian counterpart, also calling for a return to diplomacy. Well, meanwhile, France's defensive operations are stepping up. France is sending its flagship aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, to the Eastern Mediterranean. It is expected to get there towards the beginning of next week. It is also joining forces with Italy and Greece in order to try and patrol the Red Sea to ensure those shipping routes there are safe. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.
I want to go over to Brussels now. We've got a correspondent, Osama bin Javed, joining us there live. I understand, in addition to all the European countries who appear to be offering support, at least to the Gulf allies there, we now hear Spain is sending a ship to Cyprus.
Yes, this will be Spain's most advanced frigate, which is heading towards the Eastern Mediterranean, just off the coast of Cyprus, to bolster those air defenses and naval defenses. And it has come in the long line of European countries, including, as you heard from Natasha there, France, as well as Italy, who've indicated that they're going to be sending their ships in order to help their allies in the region protect their assets, as well as provide more defenses to their soldiers who are stationed in the Middle East. In the case of France, it is also a statement that because France has been the only country in the European Union taking a very strong line against what it calls illegal US and Israeli attacks against Iran. It has also criticized Iran for its responses in the aftermath, calling them illegal as well, but saying that it can take a principled position against what it sees as an illegality, but also send its military forces to defend its people and allies in the region.
I understand that European Union foreign ministers have been talking to members of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Do we know what came out of that meeting?
Yes, there's been much deliberation about what should be the European Union's response, and it appears that now it is shaping up to be a response of unity and showing support for their Gulf partners in this extraordinary meeting between European foreign ministers and Gulf Cooperation Council ministers. It was decided that they are going to continue to follow the path of trying to find a diplomatic solution to ending Iran's nuclear program, to try and de-escalate these tensions and exert their various spheres of influence, whether it's the United States or the Iranians, and again, tell their Gulf allies that they're going to continue to provide defensive support for all that is needed, including that support of the 4 years of battlefield experience that Ukrainians have had in the last 4 years with Europe's help against these drones. So there is an indication that the Ukrainians might be able to help, but again, that help will come at the cost of taking some sort of attention away from the Ukrainian side of things. So it appears that Europe stands ready, it's sending the right signals, but it is, again, more words, not much action, because all that's needed right now is for them to be able to talk to each side that listens to them and try and find a solution, because it is not just for the expatriates and the soldiers that are stationed there. It appears that if this conflict drags on for a lot longer, it will be the economy which will hurt them as well.
Osama bin Javed, they're talking to us from Brussels. Osama, thank you very much indeed. Naveen Shah is a US Army veteran and the political director of Common Defense. It's a grassroots veterans organization. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. There's been a lot of speculation over the last few days or so about what the motivation and the targets, or particularly the ultimate strategy for the Trump administration is with regard to this action in Iran. But I want to talk to you about what impact, if any, that has on the troops that are there who are actually carrying out the fighting. How important is it that they understand what the motivation for this action is?
It's very important that the troops have a strong understanding of why they're there. And thanks for having me this morning. You know, when it comes to the Iraq conflict, the Bush administration spent a year making a case for why it's important for us to invade Iraq. In this case, what they've done is simply decided one day to start this bombing campaign alongside Israel, made no case to the American people, made no case to the troops, and the support for this conflict is falling. What little support there was is falling rapidly right now.
I see that you served in Iraq, and I think it was 2009 to 2010. You traveled from Mosul to Baghdad. Of course, with hindsight, we now understand that the Bush administration's motivations for moving into Iraq at that point were based on a false premise. What does that tell you about what we're seeing in Iran at the moment? How concerned are you that we could be getting into a similar situation?
I'm very concerned that we're getting into a very similar situation right now. You know, again, the idea that Iran was an imminent threat to the United States is wrong. Like they had no intention. The idea that Iran's nuclear program was a threat to anyone when they claimed we just destroyed it during Operation Midnight Hammer a few months ago. How could it continue to be a threat if it was destroyed? none of the evidence that they are putting forward makes any sense. It seems like this was a unilateral or bilateral decision between Israel and the United States, between Trump and Netanyahu, and it really does not add up. And the people in the region are the ones who are suffering, both American troops as well as the civilians that are caught in the crossfire.
If the US and Israel have multiple objectives in Iran, all broadly with the same priority, at this stage, none seems to be more important than the other. How difficult does that make it for commanders on the ground who are trying to strategize what they are being instructed by their political leaders?
It makes it really difficult for commanders on the ground to both defend their troops, defend their positions, and plan for the next phase when it's not clear what phase one was supposed to be. If the goal in Iran was regime change, how are we going to accomplish that? Simply by bombing the Ayatollah's compound, and then what was supposed to happen next? There is no plan, no contingency for day two, let alone phase two of this assault.
I mentioned the political director of Common Defense. It's a grassroots veterans organization, as we were describing it. Looking at the servicemen and women who are currently working in this theater, how concerned are you that at least some of them are going to come back with the same level of impact that you saw in the Iraq War?
We're very concerned that the troops that are serving right now are going to be negatively impacted by this war. In fact, we've already seen that, similar to Iraq in 2003, 2004, the early stage of the Iraq invasion, troops went in without the proper equipment, without the proper armor, without the proper gear, and they lost their lives as a consequence. And now we saw that a temporary operations center in Kuwait was struck, where 6 U.S. troops were killed. And again, it didn't have the proper fortifications that are needed to defend themselves from this barrage. It seems like Iraq all over again, and I'm very concerned that we didn't learn any lessons from the past 20 years.
We appreciate you bringing us the benefit of your expertise in this, Navid Shah. So thank you very much indeed. Sri Lanka's president says they're going to start offloading 208 personnel on a second Iranian ship off its coast. That comes one day after a U.S. submarine torpedoed a warship with nearly 90 bodies recovered by Sri Lanka. Iran's foreign minister says there were 130 people on board and that the U.S. will regret the attack. Manal Fernandez reports from the port city of Galle.
And today kicks in a lot of the procedures connected to the survivors, the 32 Iranian Navy personnel that were rescued in the international waters just outside the coast of Galle, southern Sri Lanka. There's also the sort of judicial proceedings with regards to the 87 bodies that were recovered in Navy search and rescue operations. Currently, the additional magistrate of Galle is inside the National Hospital behind me to conduct that magisterial inquiry. This is very much part of procedures. We are still waiting to hear what the next steps are, but that's what's happening. Yesterday, very much the sort of initial reactions we heard from the Navy, as well as saw the bodies of those recovered being brought here. Let's take a look. Ambulances screeched through Galle, Sri Lanka's coastal tourist hub, bringing survivors from the Iranian naval frigate Iris Dina to hospital. 32 sailors were rescued by the Sri Lanka Navy and Air Force after a distress call was received from the frigate around 40 kilometers off the coast.
We saved a group who were floating in the water. After investigation and questioning, it became clear they were a crew belonging to an Iranian vessel, and they needed medical attention.
Rescue crews scoured the waters for survivors, but sources said there were no visible signs of the frigate or debris. Early reports of a torpedo or submarine strike could not be confirmed for several hours. Until this.
In fact, yesterday, in the Indian Ocean, and we'll play it on the screen there, an American submarine sunk an Iranian warship that thought it was safe in international waters. Instead, it was sunk by a torpedo.
The frigate and 2 other Iranian ships were returning from the International Fleet Review 2026,
a multinational naval gathering attended by 54 countries in Vishakhapatnam in India. The United States says this is the first sinking of an enemy ship by torpedo since World War II. Back at the hospital in Gaul, the arrival of more than 80 bodies recovered from the water. Nearby facilities were cleared to accommodate the dead. Iran's ambassador to Sri Lanka told Al Jazeera the remains of the sailors will be repatriated. The grim task of dealing with the dead. But for many of those involved in this incident, lots of questions remain to be answered. Bina Fernandez, Al Jazeera, Gaul, southern Sri Lanka.
Air travel across the Middle East has been significantly impacted by the escalating conflict. Repatriation flights have begun to arrive in Israel, where missile warnings are frequent. Sirens blared across Tel Aviv as this flight came in to land. Iranian missiles have sent millions of Israelis rushing into bomb shelters across the country. And the conflict has put shipping at risk in one of the world's key trade routes. 1/5 global oil supplies pass through the Strait of Hormuz. It's also a vital passage for large quantities of gas, and that has mostly ground to a halt. Lloyd's is a major insurance company, and it says only 40 shipping vessels have passed through the strait since March the 1st. Around 1,000 vessels are currently in the Gulf and the surrounding waters. Around half of them are oil and gas tankers. The value of the ships alone is more than $25 billion. Union leaders are also saying seafarers have the right to refuse to sail in Gulf waters because of the dangers. One of the nations that may benefit from higher energy prices is Russia. Europe and others had stopped buying Russian oil and gas because of the Ukraine war, but now many countries, including those in Asia who depend on the Middle East for their energy supplies, may lean on Moscow to meet their needs. Dmitry Medvedenko reports from the Russian capital.
Russia is one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. One huge advantage it has now, it's not in the Middle East. With Iran blocking the Strait of Hormuz, disrupting global oil and gas supplies from the region, Moscow, with its vast resources, seems perfectly poised to step in. Except it can't, at least for now, due to large-scale sanctions imposed on it because of the war in Ukraine. Russian energy exports have been squeezed by the West, leaving Moscow with just a handful of buyers of its oil, notably China, India, and Turkey, and it's selling at a massive discount. So the jump in oil prices would be beneficial for Russia, but probably not as much as it will likely benefit other exporters like the US. Still, there could be other gains. Europe has been phasing out Russian energy imports. It's still buying around 13% of its gas from Moscow, but the plan is to drop that to zero by late next year. Norway's energy minister says the EU has been very clear that they want to liberate themselves from Russian oil and gas, but then the events of the last 3-4 days have also been difficult. With the geopolitical situation we see now, I believe the debate will be revived. Russia's president says it's time to act.
А сейчас открываются другие рынки.
Other markets are opening up, and perhaps it would be more profitable for us to stop supplying the European market right now, to move into those markets that are opening up and establish ourselves there. There is no political motive here. I want that to be clear. But if they are going to close us off in a month or two anyway, then perhaps it is better for us to stop supplies ourselves now.
Kirill Dmitriev, head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund, is blaming Europe for what he called short-sighted decisions. He's the one leading talks on removing sanctions imposed on Russia. The Middle East crisis could end up improving Russia's positions at talks on ending the war in Ukraine and lifting sanctions, now that Europe and other importers may be more interested in seeing Russian resources make a comeback. Dmitry Medvedenko, Al Jazeera, Moscow.
I just want to give you a quick look at some live pictures we've got from southern Beirut. The Israeli army has been bombing areas across Lebanon. In the last few hours, it's been carrying out attacks in southern Beirut. It's also issued a forced displacement order for areas in the southern suburbs of Beirut. That usually means that there's an attack imminent. has set its lowest yearly economic growth target in 35 years. It's aiming for an expansion of 4.5 to 5% this year. That's the least ambitious target since 1991. President Xi Jinping is presiding over the National People's Congress. Communist Party leaders are setting out policies for the next 5 years. Economic growth has been slow, and that's due to a prolonged property market crisis, slow job growth, and lower consumer spending. And now the conflict in the Middle East is creating more uncertainty, as Katrina Yu reports from Beijing.
Roughly 3,000 delegates gathered here at Beijing's Great Hall of the People for the opening of the National People's Congress, where China's leadership sets its economic priorities for the year ahead. Giving his annual work report, Premier Li Cheng says the government is targeting 4.5 to 5% GDP growth and aiming to create 12 million new jobs. China also announced its military budget will increase by about 7% this year, as Beijing continues modernizing its armed forces. But Premier Li warned the global environment is becoming more complex, with protectionism and geopolitical tensions increasing. The war on Iran could have direct consequences for China. China is the world's largest oil importer, and about half of its crude comes from the Middle East, with around 40% of those shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Any disruption there could push up global prices and threaten supply. At the same time, new tariffs from Washington could put more pressure on China's export sector. Beijing's answer is a renewed push for self-reliance, boosting domestic consumption, investing more in innovation, and strengthening green and high-tech industries. The government is also planning more stimulus, with a budget deficit of around 4% of GDP and spending projected to reach roughly $4 trillion. At this meeting, China's leaders have made their goal clear, and that is to make the economy more resilient in an increasingly unpredictable world. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
Millions have turned out to vote for a new government in Nepal. It was the first general election since youth-led protests toppled the government last year. Former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli is hoping to stage a political comeback. He faces competition for Balendra Shah, a rapper turned politician. Tony Cheng reports from the Nepalese capital.
Tight security in Kathmandu as voting gets underway. Across Nepal, 300,000 additional security personnel have been drafted in. But inside the voting booths, things appear to be going smoothly. These elections weren't supposed to happen for several years, but youth-led protests in September forced the government to step down.
After the Gen Z protest last year, we realized that if we don't vote, there won't be change.
I voted so that I can have a meal cooked by my mother at home, and so that young people like me don't have to apply for jobs abroad.
Elsewhere in the capital, the interim prime minister cast her vote. These elections mark the end of a caretaker administration designed to deliver a free and fair poll. And waiting in the wings, the man who could take her place. Balendra Shah, a former rapper and mayor of Kathmandu. Much of the campaigning happened on social media, and traditional parties struggled to adapt. But this enigmatic celebrity appears to have caught voters' imagination. With polling stations across this mountainous Himalayan nation, it'll take days to count the ballots. But indications of a winner should be known within 24 to 48 hours. And that could be an ominous sign for established political powers.
Nepal is a country rooted in tradition, but there's also a feeling here that those traditions aren't really working. It's what forced tens of thousands of people out of the streets to protest 6 months ago, and what's forcing millions of people out of the country to earn a living. And it's that desire for change that's pushing them towards the polls today. Tony Cheng, Al Jazeera, Kathmandu.
Cuba's electrical grid has been reconnected after a major blackout plunged the country into darkness. The energy minister says power generation was being brought back online. Millions faced daily power cuts after the Trump administration blocked oil shipments to raise pressure on the island. Cuba's also dealing with crumbling energy infrastructure and as well as food and medical shortages. Droughts pushed Kenya deep into a hunger crisis. More than 3 million people don't have enough to eat. Over 800,000 children are malnourished and families are struggling to feed themselves. Catherine Soy reports from Turkana in northern Kenya.
Every time there's a drought in Turkana, families turn to wild fruits and berries to survive. But now the dry spells are coming more often and lasting longer. Akal Loyet says she's not had a proper meal in 2 weeks. The fruit mixture keeps hunger away, but it carries almost no nutritional value. If it doesn't rain, trees and leaves dry up. There's no water. The clinics are too far. We have to walk far to get any help. Villages are slowly emptying. Male herders, usually the providers for their families, have moved to neighboring counties in search of pasture and water for their dying livestock. Only the elderly, women, young children, and the weakest animals remain in the homesteads. I try to look for food. Sometimes it's not there. If I can't find food, how do I survive? The government's disaster management teams and other aid agencies are distributing water and food, but supplies are stretched thin, and getting aid to those who need it most is near impossible in some areas.
From one village to another village is almost 300 kilometers. Where you look at, we have pastories who are living inside the hills, getting water, getting food. It is very tough.
People in this village are lucky to receive treatment from a mobile clinic. Some children show signs of being malnourished.
Now they have gotten their food, but now they have to walk back home, sometimes kilometers away. And they say that this is not enough. They don't know the last time that they got this food, and they don't know when the aid workers are going to come back. So they say that they are worried that if they do not get help, things are just going to get worse.
Neighboring countries like Somalia and Ethiopia are also facing drought and water shortages and high levels of malnutrition. It's rainy season in Kenya, but in places like Turkana, the clouds often pass without relief. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera, Turkana, northern Kenya.
It's 17 GMT. You're watching Al Jazeera's extensive coverage of the conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran. I'm Rob Matheson. The United Arab Emirates says it's responding to incoming missiles and drones from Iran. Interceptor missiles have been seen in the skies above Abu Dhabi. In nearby Bahrain, smoke has been seen rising from an oil refinery in an apparent Iranian strike. And Iran has also continued its attacks on Qatar. 14 ballistic missiles and 4 drones have been intercepted. More strikes have been reported in eastern Tehran after Israel warned it would target the area. State media say more than 1,200 people have been killed in strikes across the country since the US and Israel began their assault on Saturday. And the Israeli army has begun bombing areas across Lebanon. It's now issued forced displacement orders for areas in the southern suburbs of Beirut. Some flights in and out of Beirut's international airport have been suspended. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah has been escalating since the killing of Iran's supreme leader. And France has authorized US forces to use its bases on the condition that they're not used to strike Iran. American troops will have temporary access to the bases on French territory to help protect Gulf countries. The UK has also announced that it's sending additional forces to the Middle East.
I can announce today that we're sending 4 additional Typhoon jets to join our squadron in Qatar to strengthen our defensive operations in Qatar and across the region.
Azerbaijan is the latest country to be affected by the conflict. 4 people there were injured after 2 drones fell near an international airport. Baku has summoned the Iranian ambassador and has told his military to prepare retaliatory measures. Now, we're going to be live in Tehran, Beirut, and Washington, D.C. But first, we're going to go to Laura Khan here in Doha. Give us the latest round around the region. As we're saying, incoming fire from Iran, we believe it's coming from Iran, to a variety of different Gulf countries at the moment.
Absolutely. We'll start in the United Arab Emirates, which has seen some of the biggest drone attacks actually in the past few days. Hundreds of drones being sent in from Iran and really putting to test their air defense systems there. We saw a number of defensive missiles intercepting some of these drones and also ballistic missiles over Ras Al Khaimah, that's just north of Dubai, and also some of them aimed towards the airport, which Iran says is a US base, is a US asset in Abu Dhabi. So there's been a lot of kinetic activity in the sky. 131 drones sent through today, and
देख
6
माल तो ऑर्डर दे
ballistic
देगा, समझा? वो लोग
missiles. And
सुबह
you
से
know, this
10 बजे
is
तक
an
आ
area
जाएगा
that
दुकान
has
में।
around
तो
200
लेकिन पैसा नहीं
nationalities
भेजेगा तो वो
living
लोग
there,
फिर
as
पैक नहीं
well
करेगा ना।
as locals.
वो लोग
It's
क्योंकि
the
ट्रस्ट नहीं
month
करता,
of
समझा?
the
जितना
holy
बार भी
month
हम
of
माल मंगाता
Ramadan
है ऐसा ही मतलब वो
for
हम पहले पैसा
Islam,
देता है,
where
फिर
usually
जाके
you
वो
would
लोग
see
माल
people
वाल पैक करेगा,
thronging the
फोटो
markets.
वोटो
There's
भेजेगा,
lights
ऐसा होगा।
everywhere. The evenings, you know, are really busy. It's also a major transport hub with hundreds of thousands of people coming through on a weekly basis. That's pretty much grounded to a halt. People are told to seek shelter when these missiles are being intercepted, to stay calm and wait to hear from the consulate. There's countries around the world scrambling to try to help their citizens either stuck there or living there. We also know that 6 people were injured earlier on in the morning from falling debris, which is why the governments are saying it's so important to seek shelter when this is happening. This was in a labor area inside of the UAE, and we know that Pakistani nationals and also Nepali nationals were injured there. So it's a very dangerous situation, of course, specifically from falling debris. It's putting the air defense missiles to the test, but it's also really testing other countries as to how they're supporting their citizens inside the country.
Khan in Doha, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we mentioned, cities across Iran are under attack for a 6th day. US and Israeli warplanes are bombing areas across the capital, Tehran. Plumes of smoke have been seen rising above the city all day. Israel says it's striking government and military targets, but residential areas and civilian infrastructure have been heavily damaged as well. We're going to go to Al Jazeera's Mohammed Val, who's in Tehran. Mohammed, just talk us through the latest strikes. What are they hitting, and how particularly are ordinary Iranians coping?
Rob, just a moment ago, there were strikes around Tehran. Not clear what specific locations and targets have been hit, but there were large explosions that could be seen through the darkness of the night around Tehran, and that's just a continuation of what's been happening throughout the day. Earlier today, huge blasts rocked the city of Tehran, and huge plumes of smoke were seen rising up in the sky. And we understood later that some stadiums have been hit, some schools, some police stations. That's an extension of what the early targets of this war looked like. Now we have facilities that are public facilities, considered public, such as schools and stadiums and so on. 20 schools across the country since the beginning of this campaign have been hit. Also, government here talking about a series of other civilian facilities like pharmaceutical centers, medical centers, and so on, hit in these waves of attacks. Cities also, other than Tehran, have been touched. Karaj in the west, Zanjan also in the west, Kashan. This is throughout the day, but earlier today also, the Iranian Kurdistan region has been hit several times, including in Sanandaj, where the state TV station was struck by a rocket or two during the morning. Fears there of people being killed and so on. The number of civilians killed is rising as we speak. More and more people today, they are talking about more than 1,200 people who have been killed. 6,000 people have been injured or hospitalized and so on. There are fears that this war is taking a new direction and it is going to be more punishing to civilians. Talking about civilians, Tehran is almost empty of its citizens. Most of them have left mostly to the north, and they are also suffering and fearing the worst to come because there is a lack of communication, blackout of the internet and other communication means, and there is a lot of fear of what may come because they don't know exactly how this war is going to develop in the next few days.
Mohammed, let's talk about some of the people who have been suffering under these attacks, because one would imagine there are those who have lost their houses, they've lost family members and so on. Is the government in any position to be able to give them any support or any aid when they're facing situations like that?
The latest we heard in this regard is that there is more than 21 metro stations that are going to be converted into bunkers for people to be able to take shelter there during the fighting. We don't know how that's being conducted until now, but also the government is sending messages to people that provisions are enough, the provisions in Iran, enough for people for food and so on. There is no until now, no disruption of electricity supplies or of water supplies, and that's reassuring for people here. But to understand also that because of the many who have left Tehran, and particularly to the north, there is beginning to be some crisis there, some lack of basic amenities in the northern part of Iran because of the sheer number of people who fled to that area, considering that it is a mountainous area full of wadis and deep valleys that where people could hide and take shelter and so on. So there is a state of panic, there is a state of fear and apprehension that probably things are going to get worse. Civilians are stuck in this, are caught in the middle of this, and because of the blackout, as I said, in the internet communication and also in other normal communications, people are unable to communicate with each other and know about their loved ones. So it's a bit of a precarious situation.
Mohammed Val talking to us there from Tehran. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as we've been reporting, Azerbaijan says 4 people have been injured after drones fell near an international airport. It happened in the exclave of Nakhchivan. Iran's foreign ministry has denied targeting Azerbaijan, saying it only strikes military bases belonging to its enemies. Azerbaijan blames Iran and says it reserves the right to retaliate.
İran tarafından Azerbaycan arazisine
Today, a terrorist act was committed by Iran against the territory of Azerbaijan and the state of Azerbaijan. The territory of the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic came under fire from unmanned aerial vehicles launched by the Iranian state. The targets of the attack were civilian facilities, including the Nakhchivan International Airport and its terminal, a school, and other civilian sites, all treacherously struck by Iran. The state of Azerbaijan strongly condemns this heinous terrorist act. Those responsible must be brought to justice without delay.
Israeli airstrikes have targeted the southern suburbs of the Lebanese capital Beirut for a 4th day in a row. Lebanese authorities have announced the death toll from Israeli strikes has now risen to 102, with 638 people injured since the escalation on Monday. The Lebanese group Hezbollah attacked Israel in retaliation for the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Israel has since been bombing Beirut and mobilized troops in the south.
My son went up to prepare iftar. There's nothing here. This is known to be a civilian building, and everyone here is a civilian. He went up for 5 minutes to get us the iftar, and the missile hit. Just like that. We're not hiding anything here.
This building was a civilian building without any affiliations. Our center, the Youth Collective, is right across the street. We're a social services center that tries to help people.
I'm going to go to Bernard Smith in Beirut. Okay, tell us what's happening where you are, first of all, Bernard.
Well, Rob, the Israeli military earlier on today issued an unprecedented forced evacuation order of Beirut's southern suburbs. Just behind me there, that's an area of some 22 square kilometers just to the north of Beirut, just to the south of me, and just to the north of Beirut's airport. And within it, perhaps as many as some 400,000 people. It's an incredibly dense center of population, concentrated population center. And since that evacuation order was issued in the late afternoon, the main arteries have been clogged with cars as people try and get out of the southern suburbs and into Beirut
तुम
and
इससे ही
further
मंगा ले,
north.
हम
The
मंगाता है
city
इससे जब
already
मतलब
full
कमती
of
माल
people who've
कमती
escaped
पैसा का माल
from
मंगाता है
southern
तब
Lebanon
इससे
after the
मंगाते हैं,
Israeli military issued a
समझे?
forced displacement order down there. That's been enforced for the last couple of days, people coming north because that's been issued. So a lot of Lebanese forcibly displaced, 83,000 at least, according to the government at the last count yesterday. There'll be more now with those trying to get out from the southern suburbs. Also, the airport has been affected, of course, with most of the flights coming in now cancelled.
Bernard, thank you very much indeed. Well, reporting from Axios, Donald Trump is saying that he should be involved in choosing Iran's next leader. The US president believes Iran's leadership are likely to select the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei as the next supreme leader, an outcome he says is unacceptable. Politicians, meanwhile, in the US House of Representatives are due to vote on whether to limit President Trump's authority to launch a war on Iran. That debate is expected to start afternoon DC time in the coming hours. Republicans in the Senate have voted down the motion on Wednesday, and it means that for now, Trump can keep ordering US forces to bomb Iran with no congressional guardrails. Manuel Rapalo's in Washington, D.C. for us. Is there any indication that the Trump administration is paying attention to what is happening?
There is an expectation that senior White House officials and President Trump himself are paying very close attention to what's happening right now on Capitol Hill. We should note that this is a vote that is expected to take place in the U.S. House of Representatives at 5 p.m. Eastern Local Time. That is 22 GMT. This is a vote over a war powers resolution that would limit President Trump's ability to continue in this conflict without explicit consent and approval from Congress. Important this is a measure that has already failed in the U.S. Senate. So in many ways, this is really just kind of a symbolic vote, more of a symbolic referendum. But it is important in that regard because this is part of that public pressure that the Trump administration has been facing, not only over the initial attack, which did not include that approval by Congress. The United States Constitution is very explicit in that it is Congress and Congress alone that holds the power to declare war. So why is the Trump administration paying close attention? Because this is part of what they are doing to mitigate. They're listening to the criticisms. They're watching what's being said on social media. They're watching what's being said in the news media to mitigate and be able to try to rein in and take control of the narrative, because the criticisms are that the administration has not been clear enough, has not been transparent enough over what the operational objectives, both in the short term and long term, are regarding the U.S.'s involvement in Iran.
Bringing us up to date there from Washington, D.C., that's Manuel Rapalo. Thank you very much. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced he's deploying additional forces to the Gulf region. He says their purpose is to defend his country's interests and its allies. He also said he spoke to Donald Trump on Saturday evening, and he stressed the so-called special relationship between the US and the UK remains unchanged.
When Iran started attacking countries around the Gulf and the wider region, the situation changed. Iran has now fired drones and missiles at 10 countries that did not attack them. These are allies of the UK, where we have hundreds of thousands of British people, as well as British military personnel. Our number one priority is protecting our people.
France has authorized US forces to use some of its bases on the condition they're not used to strike Iran. American troops will have temporary access to some bases on French territory. The French General Staff says the move is to, quote, contribute to the protection of our partners in the Gulf. Natasha Butler has more from Paris.
Well, there had been some confusion here in France over whether or not the United States was able to use French military air bases in the Gulf. Well, the French military have clarified the situation. What they are saying is that some US aircraft used only for logistical and support purposes can use some French air bases, but here in France, the French military are also saying that they have guarantees from the
बंद हो गया ठीक है कोई बात नहीं